receiving that. I like that. You know, I'm allergic to mornings, and so I was very happy to know that we were going to be meeting much further into the day. And a lot of times when I present, I don't know about you, you can only say good morning, and you hear grumblings, and good morning. And it's like, let's get a do-over. But this, we don't need to do over. All right, I am feeling this vibe. I am Eboni Zamani-Gallaher, and I'm at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. There I wear a couple of hats in the graduate college as associate dean. And there I do a lot of the steering around our diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives at the graduate level. In addition, I'm associate head of Ed Policy, Organization, and Leadership. And I also direct OCCRL, the Office for Community College Research and Leadership. And so, so got a couple of jobs, just hustling, just on that grind, But in any event, it is a pleasure to be here with you. I am really excited. I have dear friends that have been long coming to this conference, as well as former students, and who have shared with me what a really nice environment and space this is, and how receptive, pun intended, because we try to be transfer receptive, that this conference is. And so I'm happy to be with you. I'm a first timer at this conference. And what I'm going to talk about is just to kind of provide a little bit of an overview around this tension that exists, right? And so I'll share a little background about myself as we move through it, share some data from the National Student Clearinghouse Research Center, share some stuff in terms of some things that we're doing at OCCRL that are related, and then we'll kind of wrap up and have some Q&A, all right? So just to give you a little bit of a background about OCCRL. So our office is turning 30 years old, or is 30 years old actually this year. For those of you that were in the opening session, the first award winner who got the champion award after the founder for NITS, Dr. Deborah Bragg, she's the founder of OCCRL. In the 90s, I was Deb's student, was under her tutelage, but that wasn't necessarily the trajectory that I saw for myself. So the long and short of it is, it's 1995, I show up, I'm at Illinois, I'm excited. Many of you all who are advisors know all too well that students get anxious and they don't necessarily wait for that advising appointment before they decide what they're going to take. So I registered in advance of the advising appointment, and my then advisor, who had just stepped out of being vice chancellor, Dr. Levy, he says, okay, so let's talk about what classes you should register for. And I'm like, oh, been there, done that, I've already registered, I'm taking this, that, and this. And he's like, well, you need to drop this, you need to drop that, you can keep these two, and then I'm going to give you a suggestion for a couple of other classes. And one of the other classes that he suggested I take was the community college course. And this was a class taught by Deb Bragg. And, wait for it. So he tells me, I want you to take the community college class. And in my naivete and ignorance, because I was not well versed with the two-year sector, I said, but I'm here to study higher education. What you mean you want me to take a community college class? Like, do I look like I need remediation? And he's just like, oh, God, right? Okay, so this is our future. He's like, look, let me tell you something. Post-secondary has a really wide landscape. And if you're going to know it fully, you should probably be in this class. He said, this class is only offered every couple years, so since it is up this fall, you should get in it. I'm thinking, you want to know the end, look at the beginning. It's not good for me to start out the beginning going against the grain and not taking the advice of my advisor, so I'm like, fine. So I'm in the class, not wanting to be in the class, and I just said, put a fork in me, turn the lights out, I'm done. Because once I got into the literature, and at that time, in 1995, over 2/3 of all Latino students that were in college were not at these four-year institutions. They were at community colleges, and 57% at that time of black collegians were not, again, at 4-year institutions, but at 2-year institutions. And what we knew from the data at that time, which is pretty consistent to now, is that roughly 4 out of 5 students, irrespective of race and ethnicity, have aspirations that exceed the tier of post-secondary that they enter. So it's not just that they enter, but it's where they enter, and that many of them wanting to transfer, utilize the transfer function, fall short of making that transition, right? So we know that the rates have been around 15 to 25% for the last, 3 so decades in terms of those that transfer. But those are not completers. Those are just those folks that have transferred, right? And so I thought, okay, there's a gap here. There's a bridge that needs to be made. I came back from that fall semester break. I broke up with that advisor. I divorced him. I said, thank you. That was good looking out. Nice recommendation. Your services are no longer needed. I switched programs. And subsequently, my entire career trajectory has changed. And that's how I'm here before you. So that class with Deb Bragg was a game changer, just as our community colleges are game changers. So at OCCRL, we poise ourselves and we aspire to be, because if I'm perfectly transparent, we are not fully there in being a P20 shop. So by that I mean we're community college centric, but we are very much intentional and in tune, and try to be at least, about what is happening, and not in a way that's siloed, but is systemic, that is the educational pipeline, and really thinking about how students are maneuvering and transitioning in, through, and out of post-secondary, namely the community college, to further education and or gainful employment. Right, so when we think about post-secondary, and I just, came out the closet with how ignorant I was about understanding the context for collegians, I think we also have to keep in mind that there's some nuances around not just institutional type in terms of control, or 2-year, 4-year, public-private, and that kind of a thing, but also in terms of institutions by institutional type relative to minority-serving institutions or special POPs colleges, and diversity within students, right? So when we think about community colleges in particular, one of the things that's always been very thrilling for me, exciting for me, because a passion of mine, when I entered that doctoral program, in 1995, and I was pointedly asked by Dr. Bragg, as well as, just, thinking through and trying to process, well, what do I want to do? How do I want to make an impact? Who am I here for? Again, because I'm thinking about how am I going to do something outside of self for someone else. And she said, so write about what you're passionate about. What are you passionate about? And I said, black and brown folks. She's like, well, there's plenty of those, those folks in the community college. So if you are interested in, looking at the trajectory of we weren't saying Latinx then, but I'm just going to bring it into like the millennial Latinx students and African American students, then I'm sure you'll have a lot to look at. And so again, when I saw those figures in terms of participation and enrollment, the disconnect between the aspirations and the actual transition from 2-year to 4-year, let alone the completion of a 2-year degree and or a subsequent baccalaureate, I knew that I had found something that would be life-changing and sustaining in terms of my interests. And one of the things that long interested me was thinking about cultural pluralism and what that looks like. And our country has, and I'm not like figuratively speaking, but like literally has had a facelift, right? So at that time when I was studying, we had these projections, by 2050, demographers are saying that there's gonna be a majority minority, and that this new minority would be comprised collectively of racialized, minoritized folk. And we're getting there sooner than demographers had thought we would. Right? So as we think about who our students are, again, we have this disconnect and it's decoupled from who we are in terms of our staff, our faculty, our administration. And so I want to just say that has something to do with sometimes, right? It's not the cause, but it is one factor of a myriad of things that is going on when we talk about, from my title, both the cause and the cure, right? So the cause and the cure. Right, so community colleges are a cure to what? They're a cure in the sense that before the community colleges were born, we had a situation in the U.S. in terms of post-secondary where it wasn't about education for the elite. or it was about education for the elite. It wasn't for the masses, right? And so with the community colleges, the origins being such that, for me, part again of why I was attracted to this area of study is I felt they were, and also let me just say, I'm from the south side of Chicago. South side?
Right.
Yes, yes. Yay. So anyhow, now that I diverge, you'll see me code switch throughout this thing. I will pontificate and then I will be Ebony and be ebonically correct. I'm not challenged that way. So, thank you for the amen. Thank you, sis. So, now as I try to get back into my academic piece about this, one of the things that was really curious to me was the fact that, before that time, we really didn't have a massification era for post-secondary, right? So you kind of think about some key points, some key moments. As an Illinois native, I'm very proud. We love boasting about how the first community college is rooted in Illinois, Joliet, 1901. And so this whole thing about community colleges, for me, it was kind of gangster. It was kind of thrilling. It was kind of, pushing against the grain, and I felt like from its very origins, in terms of the root of its origins, that there was a social justice imperative, because it was saying, you know what, it's not about if you are from the dominant mainstream culture. It's not about if you come from money, right? Think about the Truman Commission and the fact that the community college was the institution in terms of a foray into higher learning for so many veterans, right, and diverse backgrounds of veterans. And so one of the things that I've often tried to talk about in terms of when we talk about community colleges, this tension of people saying, well, it is the go-to, or they are the colleges of choice. Sometimes the colleges of choice, but sometimes the colleges that are the only option for so many that would not have a post-secondary path otherwise, right? And so if you look at that second bullet, right, you can see that there's been this explosion in terms of community colleges, right? I remember during what we call the expansion period, so between like the mid-50s through the 60s and early 70s, Art Cohen, Florence Brower, they talk about how there had been a like 450% or so growth in the number of community colleges that were popping up across the country, right? And so we've gone from, if you just look in the millennium, since 2000, from roughly just under 6 million students in community college to over 12 million students. So one of the things that often has bothered me, and only because after my awakening in that initial course, was this kind of prisoner of elitism that community colleges have in the way that they are portrayed and how they are received, that, this is where you go when you have no other option, right? But that most times the assumption is there's academic ill preparedness, right? Those classes don't have as much rigor. We were just talking about credit loss in the opening program, and even in states where we have really tightly nested articulation agreements, right, that there's still a way in which students are audited, but it's not our statistics, or it's not our this, right? And so they're made to retake things that they already did well, because the assumption then is that our community college faculty are not providing them with a collegiate, curriculum that is as rich or rigorous, which is, I'll debunk that in a minute too. So when we talk about, are they the colleges of choice, they are the colleges that have the most culturally pluralistic student demographics. And so, here, take a look at this recent data from AACC, that again, when we talk about who's on campus, and we talk about the racialized campus climate, it just is mind-boggling to me that we are not having more conversations about the two-year context. So much of this literature is four-year centric, when in fact the critical mass of those students are not in four-year institutions. So with this last point, just in terms of thinking about intersectionality as well, we have a good number, over a third of first-gen students are not at 4-year. They're coming and starting at community colleges, roughly 1/3 are Pell eligible, and about 1 in 5 work full-time, 2 in 5 work part-time, and then again we have well over 60%, 6 out of 10 that are enrolled part-time. And so that's another thing that is particularly prickly for me in terms of bothersome, is that one way in which we have the metrics for student success often disadvantage and are disparaging to our community colleges. They are not given their just due. They are not given full credit for the role that they play in the completion or just the credit and matriculation of so many students. Because the way in which the College Board looks at that is full, like FIDIACs, first time student in any institution that is full-time attending. And we know that that's not the profile, right, of community college students. Okay, so Alicia Dowd's work, she does a lot of work around equity and how to identify equity gaps. She and Estella Bensalon. And so again, this is both the cause and the cure. A cure, right, in that we are broadening participation. We are opening up ways in which we can diversify the pipeline. But at the same time, you know, we still have these other root causes, things that are chipping away at, you know, this equity agenda that we hope to fully achieve that we've fallen short of. And so community colleges are often thought of as both gatekeepers and gateways when we think about these pathways. I'm sure many of you have heard on some occasion that students that start out at a community college are less likely or have, you know, the odds ratio is not as great for them to persist to completion for an associate's, let alone a baccalaureate degree. Just a few weeks ago, maybe 2-3 weeks at best, maybe not even 3 weeks quite, in the Atlantic, there was a new study that was an article that talked about a new study. The new study that was released by some of you, I got some co-signing, all right. I'm happy you saw it too. And for those of you who hadn't, so Jack Kent Cooke Foundation, who does a lot of work, they very much are about trying to chip away at income disparities. And so, but they don't situate or center race, but they also, I think, feel that by talking about issues around access relative to income, that, you know, you're still kind of getting at that, since students of color are disproportionately higher numbers are living in poverty, are first gen and low income. But in any event, they did some work recently where they found that community college students, once they get into elite institutions, are not just faring well, they're faring as well or better than students at, you know, these prestigious institutions. And I just thought, yeah, right? But I had also seen that play out in a different type of institutional context. I spent 13 years on the faculty at Eastern Michigan University prior to transitioning back to my alma mater almost 5 years ago. And while I was at EMU, what was really interesting to me was beyond just, you know, I don't know, within 5-6 years' time having about that many presidents, was the fact that with each one you have a new agenda, right? So you get a reset. And so there's, didn't we just do a strategic plan? Oh, out with that, because now this one wants something different. But in that time, we also started to see shifts in the enrollment. Enrollment is in terms of that institution as a comprehensive teaching state institution being very sensitive to, you know, any type of changes in enrollment, being very FTE driven, like many of our community college, you know, neighboring institutions. And so one of our presidents, I forget which one, like it was like I said, it was like 5, 6 of them in like 5, 6, 7 years time. But Kirkpatrick, it was saying, he said in his he rolled out a new strategic plan, and his priorities, number 4 at that time was transfer students in community college. And it was like, whoa. And it was interesting because 7 miles up the road is University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. All right.
Okay.
Okay. Only because I got like homies that came from, so it's like, okay, big house, right? But fine institution. But the talk was that there's, actually an easier time depending on, I guess which one to major in, but that folks were saying you can more readily get into U of M more seamlessly than you could with EMU. That we had this this kind of standoff where we had people, particularly faculty in some of the gen ed courses like in English or what have you, that were, again, jockeying for position, trying to legitimize their existence as, stuff started to decline in terms of the enrollment. We were seeing fewer, what we call that traditional college age, that 17, 18-year-old, fresh out, no lag time, enrolling in our institution. So we had to find new markets. And so the new markets that was identified at the time was, well, let's go after transfers. So I'm like, yay! So we got a transfer task force, and I'm like, we're gonna do this transfer concierge program. How you doing? We're gonna make this good. We got a transfer center. I'm like, ribbon cutting ceremony. We got the transfer center opening and grand closing. Like, it came and went in less than 2 years' time, right? Because remember, with this shift in leadership and priorities as well. So around that time, I started thinking too, like, I'm hearing my colleagues say, and I'm like, this is EMU, and they're saying, but it's not our this, or, they're probably not as prepared. And so we did a study that looked at transfer, STEM transfer students at EMU. And what we found in that study was that our students that were transfers had higher GPAs than the native students, right? So at that point, it was roughly like a 3.2 that transfers had. Overall, our STEM transfers are right at a 3.1. And then the FIDIACs, in terms of the native students, were in STEM were more like a 2.79, and then it was like a 2.9-ish for that general population of FIDIACs on average. And so I'm like, how you like those data points? They're like, well, how'd you cook it? And it's like, didn't cook it. All right, and so in any event, when we look at these institutions, again, we're talking nearly half of undergraduates today. And so it's, been, a long time coming, but it's about time that people are actually talking about the community college and in ways that aren't just dissonant. Where you would have an adjective checklist. Okay, go, community college, extension, high school, that's where you go. So it would be all of this kind of deficit-laden language. And I think that there had been a turn, particularly during the Obama years, where, very early on in his first term, from the steps of Macomb Community College in Michigan, he made the American Graduation Initiative announcement, so the AGI. And he talked about this goal of having at least 60%, similar to like Lumina Foundation, other organizations have had this benchmark that by 2025 we want at least 60%, right, of folks that have a credential. That we don't get there without the community colleges being a centerpiece to that completion agenda. All right. So when we look at kind of attainment here, you can see with associate's degrees, 55% were awarded to whites, roughly 1 in 5 to Latinos, 12% Black, African American, 5% Asian, right? And so you can also see remaining percent by age, and two or more races, right? Bi and multiracial. All right. So with the transfer profile, one of the things that I wanted to say, again, beyond the humble beginnings of community colleges to really now hold an important place in the American post-secondary landscape and to really kind of come out of what I feel is rooted at its core, a social justice imperative around broadening participation, around providing access and uplift, is a way in which we talk about transfer students and how that has shifted over the years. 46% of students who completed a bachelor's degree enrolled at a community college at some point for the data that we see for the last 10 years according to the National student clearinghouse. I want to give a shout out to Dr. Jan. I don't think Dr. Herrera's in here. Hey. And I don't think that Dr. Bernal is. But in any event, I want to make sure that I cite them because this is taken from the forthcoming Jan, Bernal, and Herrera text called Power to the Transfer. Pick it up. You can pre-order it, right? It's with Michigan State University Press. It's a part of a P20 educational equity series of books, and it's the first in the series, and I'm the series editor, so I'm so proud, I'm so happy. I was like, yay, y'all go, you go. Okay, so transfer. Some people think of transfer very simplistically, but it's a lot of layers to it. I might be speaking to the choir. If I am in some case, forgive me. We got the same song book. We're on key together. For those of you who are not as familiar, well, this is a little kind of Cliff Notes introduction, if you will. And so a lot of what we've thought about traditionally as transfer has been that 2-year to 4-year, right? Then we also have the lateral, right? That would be the vertical. Then we have the lateral that would be like a 2-year to 2-year, 4-year to 4-year. What has commonly been referred to as reverse transfer has been when a student has started at a 4-year, perhaps, you know, the psychosocial adjustment, the transition, whatever it is not working. They leave that institution and then they go to a 2-year institution as their second institution that they've attended. And more recently, what we now call RCT, and a lot of work with Jason Taylor steering that work, work that has been done with Deb Bragg as well as a leader on that work, is around reverse credit transfer, right? And I think it was good that, because early on we didn't have RCT, and I remember someone said, RCT like randomized controlled trials? I'm like, no, RCT as in reverse credit transfer, and then we needed the insertion of the C because people were getting it all, you know, confused about, well, if it's reverse transfer, they went to the 4-year and they're going back to the 2. It's like, well, physically and like literally the student is not going back to the 2-year. They have stopped short of a degree. We know that we have a problem in this country where we have over 2/5 of folks that have some college and no degree, right? So they have no labor market value in terms of a post-secondary credential in hand. And so many students, and I think, again, community colleges get dinged for this, their intention was never to get an associate. It was to do 1 semester or 2 semesters and then transfer, right? And so community colleges have been successful in helping them with whatever that individual goal is. And so to the extent that they leave, then that shows up as attrition on the community college scoreboard, right? But what also happens is now in many states, a couple dozen states, where they are actively, once students leave, let's say I left and I had 35 credit hours and I'm now at the Big U or whatever, then there's an articulation agreement where the credits that I'm taking while enrolled in my baccalaureate program of study are going back to my community college. And then I can earn my associates. And so there's also some issues with that in terms of buy-in. Some places, some institutions, 4-year institutions, are a little bit leery in the sense that, so what happens in the case where the student gets the credential and then they get a job and then they decide, you know, well, I got this degree now, I have something in hand, I'm not going to finish this other thing because I was just able to, you know, to do this job, you know, for $50,000 or whatever, particularly in the CTE areas where it's high skill, high demand, high wage, right? And so then now that looks bad on us because now we have an attrition. But life happens. And so what we have to also, in terms of advising students, is to promote, and again, getting back to that third strand for STS, is the advocacy piece. We have to advocate, inform, and make sure that folks know the labor market value of the credential. You know, that associate's degree matters, and that the cumulative effects and advantage over the life course of one's earning, even if they were to stop with just the associates, is huge, right? So here's just some ways in which we talk about transfer. Again, when we talk about, and Dimple's work has really opened this up, you know, and I want to credit her with that because a few years ago, folks weren't talking about transfer receptive cultures. That's Dimple. All right, but now it's like People drinking the Kool-Aid, like, yeah, transfer receptivity, transfer reception. I'm like, I've heard that before, and then we like, yeah. So when we talk about transfer, right, so again, this mobility piece, the swirling, you know, long gone and outdated, outmoded is this first time in any institution, and I'm completing at that institution. Multiple institutional attendance is, that's it. That's where it's at. That's just where we are. And so when we talk about transfer receptive cultures, it's not just about, and they talk about this in their forthcoming book, Power to the Transfer, shout out, shameless shout out, is that we have to think about this from all angles. So I'm going to go back to my EMU piece for a minute. In the study, one of the things that we did not think that we would come across that was really interesting was that we found 16 different attendance patterns for transfer students. And we also found that students had no less than 3 institutions at EMU, right? So we talked about how EMU had evolved to become a transfer receptive institution, but that it didn't do it because it was the right thing to do. It was in response to fear and funding and knowing that, you know, with budget impasse, and again, think about the time when the Great Recession hit. You know, Michigan was hemorrhaging long before the rest of the country had even felt it in terms of a nosebleed. And so this was really about being opportunistic. If I want to be nicer, I'll say strategic, but it wasn't altruistic, going after transfer students. And so we had even anomalies, but students that had well over 200 credit hours, no degree, and EMU was their 7th institution. It's like, wait a minute, what? All right, so again, what are the cultures between 2 to 2, 2 to 4, 4 to 4? And then how does that play out, and how funky does it really get when we think about when it's not just intrastate? When we're talking about students moving across states, right, that aren't necessarily, because there's no universal way in which these things are occurring in terms of making it seamless. All right, so, I mean, it's no wonder folks are just, they like directionless, like, what? All right, so, and then the other part of the title of this session was about, you know, trying to explore and think through what does it look like when we disaggregate? Because so much of what we've seen in recent years gives us the aggregate. And in our shop at OCCRL, we work with folks, we do executive coaching, we work with different leaders around how to identify equity gaps. Right now we have a grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation about embedding equity in guided pathways programming. And in particular, you know, we think that equity sometimes is an afterthought. And we also know that folks will conflate equity with diversity in terms of just numerical representation and not really think about what that translates to and how different that is from treating students equally, and then what those outcomes are, and if they are in fact equitable. And if the only way to get at that is to try to readily pinpoint equity gaps, not achievement gaps, not racial ethnicity gaps. No, because this is structural, this is embedded and institutionalized in a way that is so mundane that you wouldn't recognize it. It's not the individuals, it's the systems. And systems work for who they were intended to work for, right? They're designed and they advance. So when we get the results that we don't like and they produce these equity gaps, it should not come as any surprise. So when we look at these 2-year students in terms of transfers, again, most of the transfer activity in terms of the post-secondary landscape is relative to the 2-year sector having the bulk of it. And then you can see that, again, there's a small dearth of individuals, and this is data from the National Student Clearinghouse. They had a wonderful report that, I mean, I was salivating over it, like so excited to get it, because it was the first comprehensive piece that really kind of unpacked and disaggregated transfer by race, ethnicity, right, nationally. So let me just move on to this next one so you can actually see. So the 4 groups that we have here, and then you can see the for-profit, or the nonprofit, the 4-year privates, 4-year and 2-year public. And again, you see the bulk within the initial enrollments in terms of where students start out by race, they vary, right? And so most of the students in terms of students of color that are non-Asian students of color are at public community colleges. Right? And then in terms of transfer and mobility, again, thinking about the swirl, thinking about transfers in contrast to students that are non-transfer, kind of FIDIAC native students by race and ethnicity. So you can see that, again, with that cohort, because they look at the transition and the completion by race and ethnicity for just these transfers from the 2011 cohort. And so, again, this was the first time that a report included transfer patterns by race and ethnicity disaggregated. The other thing I want to mention that I don't want to overlook that I have in note here is that there's been an overall transfer rate of 38%. And when you think about that, this is just short of 3 million first-time students in this total cohort. And the bulk of those students, and this is a 6-year panel in terms of time span that is being reported and defined in terms of mobility and transfer in this National Student Clearinghouse Research Center report. All right, so percent of transfers from 2-year public. So this is that kind of the traditional way in which we've thought about transfer in terms of vertical. So you can see that it's pretty comparable for white students and Asian students in terms of the actual transition from 2 to 4 year, that they're doing so in higher numbers than Black and Latino students. And then also when we look at it in terms of the reverse, interesting. And again, when we talk about calling for disaggregation, there needs to be even a deeper dive, a more granular way in which we look at these data points and not just collect the data, but connect the data in such a way where we can unpack this too. Because my sense is with this is largely also maybe some differences in terms of ethnic group in terms of Southeast Asians versus other Asian American student groups. All right, so this is just looking at swirling. I was one of those folks that I guess would fall under this definition, and it's a wide definition, right? So swirlers are students who are enrolled part-time at 2 different institutions. It could be a 2-year or 4-year, or they're full-time at an institution, and they're moonlighting during that same semester to pick up the college algebra because they're like, I'm just trying to transition or transfer this in and not have it disrupt my GPA or something, right? And then it's those I'm home for the summer students, right? All right, but either way, you know, kind of the baseline is multiple institutional attendance. All right, so context matters. So I mentioned how it's not just that they enter, it's where they enter. And one of the things that, and this I'm just gonna, how am I doing on time? Oh, okay, we're doing good. All right, so in terms of, just real quick before I transition into that, I just wanna say that last point, I wanna make sure I emphasize the role of community colleges in terms of meeting the needs of the transfer student population, particularly those that start at a 2-year that are Asian and white are more likely to go on to a 4-year, but then also when we talk about, and respectively 48% and 53%, but then again, you know, that is much higher than the kind of little over 1/4 and little over 1/3 for Black and Latino students. And so one of the things I thought about was, again, community colleges are game changers. But at the same time, and they are often marginalized on the margins of when we think about this larger post-secondary context. And so you have the institutions that are marginalized trying to meet the needs of those that are most marginalized, right? And so in thinking about marginalized, underserved, minoritized students, one of the things that I wanted to think about too is is there a difference when we talk about institution type within our community colleges? So when we talk about MSIs, minority serving institutions, more often than not, again, knee-jerk is these are four-year institutional contexts. Nobody really talks about MSIs that are two-year institutions. In our office in the last few years, we have really endeavored to what we've coined as MSCCs, minority serving community colleges, to really take a look at it and try to get a sense of the extent to which there is a cultural congruity, a person-environment fit in such a way where we see numbers in terms of transfer and completion that bode higher than predominantly white institutional contexts that are two-year institutions. We currently have a grant from NSF to look at how Hispanic serving community colleges in particular are again serving as a conduit for diversifying the pipeline, and particularly when we think about our needs in terms of STEM workforce. All right, so one of the things that, again, I was telling you how we've had this shift and we've had a facelift, literally where it's been a makeover where in the U.S. we have the most culturally pluralistic society that we've ever had, and our institutions as microcosms of the larger society, we're seeing that play out in many contexts. Community colleges, again, there will be variation in terms of geographical location, as they are very reflective of those immediate local community contexts. But one of the things that I wanted to just highlight for those that aren't as familiar with MSIs is, again, we have the different, I think, nuances, if you will, in that, and I purposely kind of segregated this from this area so you can see the different type of minority serving institutions. But there is, what we're finding in our own work, there's some differences that play out when institutions, again, organic at the root, from point of origin, were that evolved with the express purpose for advancing the education of indigenous learners, for advancing the education of newly freed slaves. There's something very different, because when we say HBCUs, again, people think 4-year. They don't think about historically black community colleges. And up until the 90s, you know, there have been a good number of them. There's roughly about 11 or 12 of them left now. One in particular that is really interesting to me in terms of a case study for later is St. Philip's College in San Antonio, which has the wonderful kind of background of being a historically black community college, right? It was created for newly freed slaves, but has evolved to become an HSI. So again, these are mission driven, and there's something different, and we're still, you know, finding some interesting things, and some of our work really aligns with some of the work that Gina Garcia is doing, some of the work of Anna Nunez, but where there's a way in which, and their work has been largely centered on 4-year, and ours being community colleges, that it's not as tightly coupled, this MSI designation, with the actual institutional identity. So our initial kind of thesis or hypothesis, if you will, of that there be this better kind of environment or a cultural congruence that's more innate. Yeah, I can't really say that as a rule of thumb. But we do see that for those institutions that are enrollment driven versus mission driven, that yeah, there is some really interesting dynamics and differences. So just real quick, we had 248 community colleges in this larger study where it had an MSI designation. Again, when we look at the landscape of all community colleges, and keep in mind community colleges, we have a little over 1,100 community colleges in the country, that 46% of that 1,100 are minority serving community colleges. Okay? And then when we talk about the demographics at MSIs in general, not just HSCCs, but we see these numbers play out in terms of you know, what those populations look like for minority serving community college demographics within the whole of the community college landscape. In relationship to the HSCCs, you see 25 a quarter, that is one of the distinctions in terms of you have to have at least 1/4 of your enrollment be, you know, Latino, Latina. And there's also other aspects in terms of a percent that are Pell eligible and the like. And so that the monies that are earmarked that come from the feds when they give this federal designation of MSI, again, is supposed to be around capacity building monies to help serve underserved and minoritized populations. So when we look at just the community colleges that have an HSI designation, and this was not surprising to me, again, being a city slicker coming from, you know, Chi-Town, that 80% of HSIs are those community colleges in urban areas, right? Because you got to, again, think about these are enrollment driven. Where do you see most communities of color reside, right? In my own home state, we are an anomaly. So for the Great Lakes region, we are the only state out of 12 states in that Midwest, that kind of heartland, that have MSCCs. So we have 16 minority serving community colleges in the state of Illinois out of a total 48 community colleges. And out of those 16, 9 of the 16 are Hispanic serving community colleges. So this is a browning in society, and it came straight through Illinois, and then it, you know, went southwest and everywhere else, right? And so one of the other things that I want to point your attention to is that this is going to continue. So I wanted to do some mapping, looked at kind of in terms of available data from the iPads data, as well as looked at some data relative to the IES data set in terms of looking at the students themselves. So we were looking at NAILS, which is National Educational Longitudinal Data, as well as iPads. And so in 2005, you can kind of see, right, plotted here in terms of this mapping of where Hispanic serving community colleges are. And then 10 years later, right, this is primed to continue to trend and keep pace. And then also keep in mind, I didn't unpack it for you here, but in many cases, we have where the institutions have multiple MSI designations. So for instance, in Illinois, I told you we had 9 that were HSCCs, but we had 16 that are MSIs. Well, City Colleges of Chicago, that is a, you know, community college district with 7 institutions, but each of the 7 institutions for City Colleges of Chicago are MSIs, some of which have multiple. So one is an ANAPZ and an HSI. There's another that's a PBI for predominantly black and HSCC, and you know, so. All right, so again, in terms of the data sets that because we're doing secondary analysis of some larger scale data sets, what we found just, again, kind of nationally in terms of students is, in terms of community colleges, is this is what we're looking at in terms of the demographics, all right? And then when we break that down and we try to disaggregate by race, ethnicity, and gender, this is what we're seeing in terms of who's completing in terms of their first major for STEM, because we're looking at STEM pathways. So what you can see is largely white women and white men, followed by Hispanic women, Hispanic men, then African American women, right? But this is, again, and part of why this is so low, this is not because Asian American students aren't faring well in STEM. They're just kicking butt and doing it at more so 4-year institutions and elite selectiveness. All right, so when we talk about the degrees conferred, we want to look at the most populous states in terms of this trend that's moved in terms of HSCCs. So in terms of 8 states, plus Puerto Rico, this is what we're finding when we break it out by race and ethnicity in terms of STEM degrees, right? So again, still mostly whites. And then when we look at it just in HSCCs, right? So, I mean, that wouldn't be too surprising that you would hope at least that Latino students are the ones that are faring best within HSCC environments, but followed by that are white students. Okay. All right, so I probably got, what, 5 minutes, 10 minutes? I'm not going to read this to you. We all know, and this part of why we've convened is that there's a perennial challenge, right, in terms of how might we make transfer more seamless, how do we remove barriers and blockages for students, and I think some of the ways that we do that, you know, with some of these bullet points. In particular, I think that we have to think through what will be ways in which we utilize our data, not just collect data, but connect data. And I'm saying that having come fresh off of doing some interviews for the case studies part of this study that I kind of shared a little bit with you about, where I had a dean tell me, well, yes, we're HSCC, but we don't do anything special for Latino students because we don't want anybody else not to feel special. I'm sorry, you just got how much, what, title what money? And you like, no? He said, well, you know, a rising tide lifts all boats. And I said, so what are can you tell me what you're doing with disaggregation of your data by race, ethnicity, and gender? Oh, we don't do that. We don't do that. Maybe we should. Yeah, maybe you should. All right. So, again, we need to streamline things. We still have yet to create a system that is user-friendly for the student in terms of the portability of the credits. I'm not even going to touch, you know, credit for prior learning or touch competency-based learning because, again, we got to get beyond just units in terms of credit hours and start thinking about how experiences are going to help in the credentialing in terms of competencies. And so, all right, I have some references here. Hey, stay in touch. We send out, you know, twice a month. We have our network news. Feel free to join us. And there are also other things that might be of interest, such as our Democracy's College podcast and our Distinguished Diversity Lecture Series, all of which you can access videos and the audio podcast on iTunes or on our site, as well as any reports and our Views and Viewpoints blog. Questions? Yes.
Does that include particular types of collaborations as far as men of color initiatives? I know we do have some of that. I'm not sure I'll email that to you. And also, we do have, of course, undocumented DACA students that we also contact. So I'm curious about the numbers in that too, and how that, because they're more favorable and we're more accommodating of undocumented DACA students, and therefore schools that aren't right.
Yeah, so let's talk after this because at a couple of our sites, some stuff I could share with you that's specific to Black male initiatives, as well as DACA.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, oh, yes.
Sorry. When you were talking about the transfer students, STEM GPAs coming in, was that combined or was that institution, like university GPAs?
There's their university GPAs that we looked at, right? So these were students that had transferred, again, many of them from multiple institutions, and their overall GPAs were still higher on average than the native or FIDIAC students in that case for not just STEM, but the larger student body. But again, one of the surprise findings was that students hadn't went to as many institutions as they had gone to, and the attendance patterns of where a student may have started at, say, a DeVry, right, or Everest Institute, and then they went to a community college, and then they went to a 4-year, and then they went to another 4-year, and then they went back to a community. It was just crazy kind of patterns where we had lateral, vertical, lateral, reverse. I mean, and it was, right, and this is actually before Michigan really got into taking a look at reverse transfer of credit, right, or reverse credit transfer. All right. Well, one thing I was supposed to plug is you all have some evaluation forms. So if you can fill those out, I was informed that they would like for you to either leave them on this table or on the back stage here. So thank you for spending time with me this afternoon.